Somebody asked me to watch this video from Moon called Uber Won't Exist in 5 Years. Here is why. I'd like to know why. Frankly, I mean, I really do wonder why. Because I feel like Uber was kind of putting out the taxi businesses out of, well, business. Because they're generally cheaper. But though I will say the problem is that the amount of money people get is not that great. You don't get a whole lot of support. I used to do Uber and Lyft for a while. That's like a second job back in the day. Not too great. I remember one story with Lyft is I went to pick somebody up. It was after like a hurricane or something, or like some kind of superstorm or whatever it was. And there was a huge flood. And the person, I guess they were on the other side of the flood. They had just gotten off like the boat or something. So I pull up in my Kia Soul and I'm sitting there and like I message a guy, I'm like, I'm here. He's like, oh, drive through the water. I'm like, no. Because the flood, like when I tell you the flood was like, it was deep. It was like knee deep. And I'm like, I'm not driving my car through an actual flood. I don't want to like intake water. And then all of a sudden I'm stuck because some guy, like, you're going to have to walk through it. And he refused to do it, so I left. And he got really angry at me, but like, I ain't going to mess my car up for some like fucking $10 trip, asshole. Anyway, let's watch the video.
Going to exist in a few years, as it's becoming clear that Uber's not going to exist in a few years, as it's becoming clear that Uber is in very deep trouble after more than 3,000 layoffs, the closure of dozens of their offices, and the company's stock value falling by 2/3 in only a year.
Maybe if they actually paid their people better. That drove.
It's becoming very clear that Uber is on its final legs. But how did such a promising company sink so low? Why is their stock continuing to fall, even after the company has finally managed to become profitable? What made the Uber empire crash down into the ground? Well, the first reason lies in Uber's business model. You see, from the start, the company's general way of doing business is by acting as a middleman between drivers and passengers. As we all know, a user simply enters their location and destination, and then a nearby driver can accept the trip. Once the trip's over,
well, it's not just a middleman. It's the app infrastructure is also like solid too. Like they are a middleman, but they're not just a middleman. They also have like this infrastructure in the app. That service allows people to collect to collect rides and go on rides and set themselves up for rides without giving out personal information to the other person receiving it. It's a little bit more trustworthy.
The payment is done through the app, and no money changes hands at any point. After the trip, both the drivers and passengers give each other ratings. And at first, this business model seems great. It's completely revolutionized the taxi industry. Uber is a much more convenient way of getting a taxi compared to all the other options. With just the press of a few buttons, you don't have to go through the hassle of calling up a taxi company. However, while this looks great on the outside,
I'll tell you one thing. I once did an Uber run. Pretty sure I did a pretty big drug deal. I grabbed somebody from one place, and then I drove them somewhere. And while we were driving, the guy was nice, but he was going telling me about a lot of crazy conspiracy theories. And once we got there, we drove back. So I think I did some kind of a drug run, but it is what it is. And another time I actually was just in the car with a dude who sells weed, and then I got his number, and so I could buy from him. That shit was stanky, bro. That shit was stanking. Some good shit.
This business model is much more sinister than it first seems. For starters, Uber prefers for their drivers to be viewed as independent contractors rather than actual employees, meaning that technically, Uber doesn't have to pay any of their drivers a minimum wage, nor do they have to pay sick pay or any other kind of benefits whatsoever.
Yeah, I mean, I'm fine with that. I think that's a fine business model. It seems like they don't give quite a good enough of a percentage of the money. Considering the fact that like there's in my opinion, very little middlemanning to do. I mean, you created the app, of course, which costs money, but outside of that, like there's really nothing else you have to do. It's all like upkeep.
Uber also doesn't own any of the vehicles and won't cover maintenance, fuel, or anything else. All of these burdens rest
well, yeah, but you could write off fuel and whatnot. You could write off a lot of the expenses
on the shoulders of their drivers. And from a purely economical standpoint, this business model is revolutionary. It's great for Uber because they don't have to pay their workers nearly as much as the traditional taxi services. However, Uber's problem was that lots of this was actually illegal. In fact, from the get-go,
really?
Uber's practices were illegal in San Francisco, where they originated from.
Wait, why?
Something that would quickly come
Hold on.
illegal. In fact, from the get-go, Uber's practices were
why is it turned sour on Uber, Lyft, and other running apps?
Illegal in San Francisco, where they originated from. Something that would quickly come back to bite Uber. However, back when Uber was founded,
you know, it's fucked up. This is my understanding of New York taxis. Like, one of the things that's like really bad is apparently the way that New York taxis work is that there's only a certain number of taxi drivers that are actually allowed to drive in New York. And so they have like a medallion. I think it's like a gold medallion or something. And for whatever reason, the way that New York does this is that you have to buy and sell that medallion, and it costs so much money. Right? This is just what I was told, so I hope I'm right. And at one point, apparently it cost like $1 million to buy like the medallion to drive in the city. So basically the concept was, a mechanic told me this, now I'm saying it out loud, I wonder if this is true. Um, Taxi New York medallion. I'm gonna confirm this. I wonder if this is real. Part of me is feeling like this isn't real anymore. I'm gonna keep telling the story. But anyway, apparently you had to buy the medallion. They were worth a lot, so like that was your retirement. You'd sell it. But then once Uber came into place, it like drastically. Yeah, actually, this is true. After peaking at more than $1 million, medallion values plunged because of competition from Uber and Lyft. So these people who like would basically take out mortgages, almost massive loans on medallions, would actually end up the value dropped from like $1 million to like 150,000, and it just decimated their ability to retire, which is really fucked up. But then apparently there's also a company that would just rent the medallions, which is kind of shitty, so they would buy them all up and shit. It's kind of crazy, but
regulators hadn't caught on to their tactics yet, and so Uber had a very small period to monopolize the taxi industry and become too big to stop. And so in order to take over the taxi industry, the company would make many sacrifices by taking on heavy financial losses early on, all in the name of continuing their expansion.
That's so fucked up though. Like I'm pretty sure Amazon did that to put out bookstores out of business. Like it's always fucked when they take a huge like financial loss just to like kill their competition. That sounds incredibly immoral. Like you just taking the losses because you can take them just to bully the other competition out of the way. Even though you don't have a sustainable business model. And then once they're out of the way, you can just jack your prices up because there's nothing else to compete. Like, what a scum fuck tactic.
The only thing keeping Uber afloat was the large investments they were receiving, as Silicon Valley was betting that Uber was going to monopolize the modern transportation service industry. And if Uber was able to secure a monopoly, they would eventually become extremely profitable. If they were the only option on the market, Uber can then jack up the prices without worrying about being undercut by the competition. In fact, a monopoly was necessary for Uber due to the extremely thin profit margins that their business model gave them. However, the company's lack of profitability didn't faze Uber or their investors. They were putting all their chips on the rapid growth. And for a while,
but how is it profitable?
This paid off. In just a few short years,
like all they have to do is run a fucking app and then the driver does the rest. I don't remember the percentage splits. It might have been 70-30, 75. I don't remember, actually.
Uber services had been rolled out across the world. This was a genius strategy in a lot of ways, and this was all coming from one man known as Travis Kalanick, one of the key founders who created Uber. And it was also because of Kalanick that Uber became such a controversial company. But back in the early years of Uber, and the negative press towards the company wasn't anywhere near what it is today. In fact, at the time, Kalanick was a business prodigy. Under his
So they said that they only take 25%, but this is claiming that they might take up to 42.75% based on like certain conditions. Okay.
Leadership, Uber successfully expanded from a small San Francisco startup to a global sensation. And the strategy behind this was fairly simple. As we've discussed, Uber's
that still seems like a lot of the money. Like, I mean,
business model was genius. Genius in the sense that they didn't have to pay their workers properly. And at the same time, Uber would offer insanely cheap deals to entice people to use their services. It wasn't uncommon.
But I believe the deals are on Uber's end, so they'll take the cuts on the deals. Maybe that's why they weren't super profitable.
Your first Uber trip to be free, or for the company to give you referral bonuses if you managed to get your friends to try out the app. These marketing methods exploded Uber's user base, with all of this only being possible due to the giant influx of angel investors flowing into the company.
That's so interesting though, because if they just didn't like go so aggressive on their marketing plan, they probably could have been like more long-term sustainable.
Without the investors, Uber would be nothing. And as Uber started catching on, the app would only become more and more popular, becoming a central part of millions of lives, allowing Uber to have substantial bargaining power later down the line. It seemed like everything was perfect for Uber. They had established themselves so tightly in modern society that it became so much harder for a city to ban or regulate Uber.
It's crazy because when I did Uber, like there were days where I'd make like up to $40 an hour, which was crazy. But then there's days where you'd make like 10, maybe less than that an hour. You know, you're just sitting in your car waiting. You'd turn Lyft and Uber on, right? And if you get a call from one, you'd hit it, and then you'd go offline on the other one. It was crazy.
This aggressive and borderline illegal strategy led to unprecedented growth, but it wouldn't take long for the consequences to catch up with Uber, because Uber's aggressive expansion had given Uber a lot of enemies. The first of these was San Francisco.
Like Gargamel from the Smurfs. He was after them for a while.
Francisco's local government. After the government started noticing how Uber was skirting regulations, they sent the company a cease and desist letter with substantial penalties if they did not comply. The notice threatened $5,000 fines for every trip and a possible 3-month jail sentence for every day the company continued operating. Now, for most people, this would have completely destroyed the company, but not Uber. Instead of abiding by the government's demands, Uber just continued operating. As Uber had already entrenched themselves so deeply into San Francisco, they were now coming to control the entire transportation market. Knowing how much power they now had.
So they knew that they wouldn't be able to punish them because they were so necessary to the infrastructure. That's crazy that people got so dependent on Ubers in San Francisco that it would actually hurt local businesses. that if they weren't able to get carted around from place to place. That's actually fucked up.
Uber released a press statement that snubbed the order, stating, "Uber is a first-to-market, cutting-edge transportation technology, and it must be recognized that the regulations from both city and state regulatory bodies have not been written with these innovations in mind. As such, we are happy to help educate the regulatory bodies on this new generation of technology." This early statement from Uber was symbolic. It summarized their entire business model. Uber completely rejected the law and had an almost pompous attitude in saying that we are happy to, quote, educate the San Francisco government. However, this incident would only be the first of Uber's many brushes with the law, and this was all trickling down from Kalanick's leadership. Before he founded Uber, Kalanick previously started a company called Scour, but he had to shut it down after he was fined billions for copyright infringement. Kalanick never paid the full amount, of course, but this showed that he wasn't afraid of breaking the rules, and breaking the rules was exactly what Uber was doing. After establishing themselves in 2011 across the US, the taxi industries were certainly not happy with this. How could they compete with Silicon Valley funded, below minimum wage drivers who were completely outcompeting the taxi industry?
Well, okay, when they keep saying below minimum wage drivers, like that's not necessarily true. If you're in a super busy area, chances are these people are making decent salaries, just probably not the amount of money that the taxi drivers are making. So like if you're in a really busy area like a city, you're making money. You're probably making decent money. You might be making 25, 30, 35, even $40 an hour, not even with tips. And a lot of times people cash tip. If you're in some rural fucking area, like you're not going to make a whole lot of money at all, obviously. But like I doubt the people in the city were making like a decent wage, honestly.
The entire US taxi industry realized that if they couldn't put a stop to Uber, all of them would be out of business. Because of the pressure from these taxi organizations and other industry leaders, new legal measures were enacted across 15 major US cities, which included rules that seemed to be targeted directly towards Uber. For example, the government made it illegal to use a GPS as a meter for calculating drivers' fares. Additionally, cab drivers using
What? Why?
the government made it illegal to use a GPS.
Will make it illegal for luxury car services to use GPS devices to meter as a meter, and also makes it illegal for them to pick up customers less than 30 minutes before the departure time. What? This goes on top of various regulations. That's such a that's odd. That's like not even like a there's nothing necessary about that law. That's literally implemented just to hit Uber. Like this is the whole crazy thing, because I can understand why people would want to regulate Uber. I would say that like the better idea to regulate Uber is based on the fact that the drivers don't go through a substantial background check. I mean, they grab your name and whatever, and then that's pretty much it. And they grab your driver's license, of course, and stuff like that. But like they don't know, bro, and like it's a kind of an unsafe thing. You know, it sets up like a really uncomfortable metric. You know.
GPS as a meter for
especially for women, honestly, when you got like a male driver
calculating drivers' fares. Additionally, cab drivers using their phone while driving was now forbidden, even if they were only using it for the Uber app. However, this didn't faze Uber. They'd already bypassed the San Francisco government. The Uber leadership realized they had so much power over the transportation industry that nothing could hold them back, not even the government. But one thing the company couldn't ignore was a class action lawsuit from over 350,000 former and current Uber drivers. The 2013 lawsuit suggested that Uber owed the drivers a minimum wage as well as sick pay while working for the company. This case would then drag out for years. Uber would use the best laws possible. And
like this is one of those things where like you could definitely argue for better monitoring of Uber, but this concept that they deserve like minimum, I mean, just don't use the app, get a real job. You know what I mean? Like I use it as a secondary job for secondary income, but it's freelance work. I mean, I don't really see the issue with them not paying like an actual wage, you know. Because then at that point, what's stopping them from being like, oh, you're on minimum wage, why should they pay you any additional money at that point? You know what I mean? How would you even implement that? Because then they would have to reduce the amount of money you get per trip to pay everybody a minimum wage, and then like how do you get a minimum wage? Like, do you have to be online a certain amount of time? You have to have like a certain number of like acceptances. Like, I don't really know how it would work, and I just think it's kind of silly.
And eventually settled out of court with only a small portion of the claimants for around $20 million. These issues slowly became incredibly common for Uber, and the company was now starting to hemorrhage a lot of money. However, for now, this didn't matter. All that mattered was that Uber would expand across the world and monopolize the taxi industry. If they could do this, they would be a billion-dollar company. Of course, by this point, Uber was nowhere near being a profitable company, but this isn't exactly unusual for tech startups. The general model for these businesses is to operate on a loss for multiple years in exchange for user growth, as once you've built the client base, the business can eventually be made extremely profitable. This is the same with WhatsApp, Discord, or like how Amazon was running on a loss for years before it came to dominate the economy, and it seemed like Uber was—
Yeah, it's because they're cutting their spending to fucking put other businesses out of business, which is really fucked up.
Following this trajectory, or so it seemed, because there were a few key reasons why—
Oh, did New York implement city fees for Uber? Kind of makes sense. Well, in order to be a taxi driver, you have to go through, I believe, a lot more than just like a simple background check, and then you're gonna go. You know, it's a whole career thing, and people put a lot of money into buying those medallions so that they could retire on that and Imagine you buy a medallion for $1 million and then like you're retiring on like $150,000. Like it's not even worth it at that point. You know, you're fucked. That really fucks a lot of people over. That's one of the problems with like the implementation of like a lot of technologies here without us catching up and actually regulating them properly in general.
This dream would never come to fruition for Uber, which leads us on to the second reason for why Uber is collapsing, and that point being that they actually failed to ever gain a monopoly.
True.
If you've been following my videos, I'm sure you know how suspicious I am of mainstream media, because oftentimes mainstream media can be the biggest impediment to understanding the truth and keeping you stuck in ideological bubbles. Ground News shows you how breaking news is being covered across the political spectrum.
Oh, it's an ad.
They do this by gathering news from 50,000 sources around the world and puts all related articles in one place so that you can easily compare coverage. By doing this, Ground News allows you to see the story behind the story, using data-driven analytics that looks at
I feel you.
your emotions. Morality is in subscribing.
There's a lot of different apps like that. It's so
At
interesting.
first, Uber really did
I did a plug for an app like that on TikTok a while ago, but it's called something else.
make up the entire market of this public transportation method, which is why Uber was finding so much success during the initial phase of its operations. Uber's system was the first of its kind. It was revolutionary. Until a competitor was launched, Uber essentially had a monopoly on this type of business model. Shutting down any kind of competition was key to ensuring longevity for the company, and if Uber played their cards right, it was possible for them to keep their monopoly on this kind of public transportation. This could be done through methods like making deals with taxi companies, or by offering better wages and service prices than any of their competition could afford. However, this wasn't the case. Uber's leadership was infatuated with the idea of disrupting the taxi industry rather than securing their foothold in the market. And it was because of this ill-advised mindset that competitors soon began popping up, and Uber would start to lose their footing as the undisputed king of public transportation apps. The main competition came in the form of Lyft.
So Lyft is what we call poverty Uber. Okay. It's called poverty Uber. What's going on? How are you doing?
The second ride-sharing app and
Uber.
Uber's long-standing rival. Uber was Coke and Lyft was Pepsi. Lyft was marketing themselves as the underdog and a friendlier alternative compared to Uber. Lyft would focus on reducing the anonymity between drivers and passengers, while also making user trip statistics as detailed as possible. Lyft was also prioritizing the implementation of extra safety features for their drivers, such as yearly background checks and a mandatory anti-sexual assault training program. But Lyft wasn't the only one. Soon there would be a bunch
Can't believe they would do that. Just kidding.
of apps all competing for Uber's market share, such as Bolt, who focused on the European, Latin American, and Near East markets.
I didn't even know what Bolt is, dude.
You see, in recent years, Bolt has expanded their operations to 45 countries and over 100 million customers. While these similar companies are all facing problems with legal regulations,
Company failing to protect users from assault. Yeah, see, I was saying that before. Lyft sued by drivers, passengers, claiming company failing to protect users from assault. I just don't know how they would do that. There's just no way they could do that. Which just is a fundamental flaw of the ride-sharing service. Bolt responds to the customer suit. Yeah. It's fucked up. Plus, there are people who will like cancel the trip mid-trip, and they'll be like, "Oh, just pay you cash. Go here," and then it's just a whole fucked thing.
their approach to expansion was much less aggressive than Uber's. Along with this new competition, Uber was also having issues making their entry into other countries. The legality in some countries made it either difficult or completely impossible for Uber to operate in some areas. Because Uber is a direct competitor to taxis, the app is banned in many locations. Germany, Portugal, and Italy have all partially banned Uber, while places like Denmark and Hungary have completely outlawed Uber, mainly due to the app stripping money that could be instead going towards taxi organizations as well as the government. And where Uber has been banned, other companies have now stepped in to fill the gap. For example, in Budapest, Bolt has thrived where Uber has been outlawed. Even in
Now I remember. Okay, so when you were saying that they pay New York, I'm pretty sure I remember this now. It just like came to me. I think that they have to subsidize the taxi industry. So the payments that they give are actually going to the taxi industry, so that they don't go under, which makes sense, bro.
Denmark, where ride-hailing services are universally banned, Bolt has a fleet of e-bikes for hire. Not to mention Bolt Food, which has taken over the European markets by storm.
That's a cool idea, though. The whole bike thing. You know, renting a bike, moving somewhere else, kind of makes sense. I just don't know how it would really work.
Consequence of all this competition is that it has severely disrupted what was supposed to be Uber's endgame. This solid competition has killed any dream that Uber once had of a full monopoly on the ride-hailing industry. This was essential for Uber's business strategy to work. Without a monopoly, their plan is missing a crucial aspect. But it wasn't just the competition that stood between Uber and a monopoly. As everywhere Uber expanded, they would cause unrest, protests, and violence, which would soon become the third reason for Uber's downfall.
Yeah, it makes sense. Well, it's because you have a lot of middle class workers who depend on driving for a living, taxi driving for a living, revolting. Of course they're going to. You're literally like it's ends up killing their family. You know, I know it's a little dramatized, but I mean, realistically, if you can't afford to take care of your kids anymore, like imagine you're working a job and all of a sudden, boom, it just dies out. You know what I mean? They're just like, okay, bye, your job's gone, and Uber's intentionally operating in a way that's like shitty. Of course, you're gonna get fucked. People are gonna revolt. They're gonna protest, and they should.
You see, their reckless expansion was leaving a wake of destruction.
Yeah, as a rider, you pay for the tolls. Is that true? I'm trying to. Oh, it is true. You know why I was saying is it true? You know what the fucked up thing though is that as a driver, as a rider, you should pay the tolls, but as the rider, like, or as the driver, you still have to pay the toll on the way back. That was fucked up. I remember taking a trip, like really far trip. It was like a 2-hour drive. And then of course, once you drop them off, not only you pay the tolls, but then like you have to drive back home. And so you can set a destination to head back home and take trips on the way, but it's such a small chance that you're going to end up getting somebody to take you, like, that's going to take a trip back home just like conveniently for you. So I remember driving like 2 hours, and then I did the thing on the way back home, and I got some girl that wanted to go get pizza. So it was like a 5-minute trip. I was like, oh my God, it was so fucking stupid. Luckily the person tipped me pretty well in cash, but it's like fucking crazy. You didn't think of that. Yeah, it's fucked. People don't think of it like that. Isn't that crazy? It's something else, man.
Uber's continuing war with the taxi industry was playing a massive part in this. On January 26th in 2016, over 2,000 French taxi drivers protested Uber's presence in Paris. They did this by blocking the roads, which quickly brought the city centre to a standstill. And what began as a relatively peaceful protest quickly turned violent. Over 20 taxi drivers were arrested for crimes like assault and arson, all targeted at Uber drivers. But it was only until recently that the full details were uncovered on how far Uber had gone to instigate the growing tensions and violence coming from taxi organizations. Mark McGann, a whistleblower and former Uber lobbyist, gave a clear window into Kalanick's and the company's tactics by leaking a set of documents that was coined the Uber Files. Thousands of these documents were leaked to The Guardian and later published in spring of 2022. The Uber Files detailed a plethora of reckless and negligent decisions coming from the company's upper management, and the name that came up the most in these leaked papers? CEO Travis Kalanick, who was quoted as saying this about the violent protests in France.
It's always the handsome guys that cause the most trouble. Am I right, guys?
Quote, I think it's worth it. Violence guarantees success. And these guys must be resisted, no? Agreed that right place and time must be thought out. Uber's mission has always been to disrupt the taxi industry. However,
doesn't Google Maps show you the routes to avoid tolls? Yeah, it could. I think that, I don't know if Uber did this, but I know Lyft would allow you. So I'm pretty sure this is when I did it. So things could have changed. When Uber had their thing, that would just link to their own like in-app whatever bullshit. Lyft allowed you to link to Google Maps, so you could change your destination, of course, or rather you could change like the way that you go there. I think you could do that, but that's really up to the passenger as well, you know.
For the Uber Files,
but those things are crazy, man. That shit's crazy though. Because sometimes you'll get to avoid a toll, but it'll bring you like 45 minutes out of the way, and it doesn't even do anything. You know what I mean? Like you end up just wasting more money going out of the way.
Does make it clear that Kalanick and other executives of the company put the mission of agitation above the safety of their drivers. Not to mention the public. Uber's questionable reasoning behind sparking violence in the streets was that it would put pressure on regulators to inhibit taxi companies. Protests,
Jesus, what a bunch of scumbags,
would lead to anti-taxi publicity, which would then cause regulators to sway towards Uber's side. However, this is a key reason that Uber is currently in deep trouble. The singular focus that Kalanick brought with him was excellent.
Bro, see, if they just operated in a more respectful way, they'd probably have like a decent like area cut out in the market
for the company's expansion. Yet he was more of a wartime leader rather than a peacetime one. And so once the time came for Uber to consolidate their hold on the transportation industry, they had already built up too much bad blood with the wrong people. The taxi companies they fought for years weren't very interested in making.
Yeah, you built the wrong bad blood with the Italians who ran the taxi services.
compromises once they knew they could survive Uber's innovations. All around the world, violence was erupting between taxi drivers and Uber drivers. In places like Cancun and Mexico, Uber drivers would actually be hunted down and even murdered by the Mexican taxi mafia.
Jesus Christ, that's a little far. It's not the Uber driver's fault. Oh my God. Wow. Well.
However, the Uber files make clear that Uber has no problem with this. They will take advantage of these seemingly isolated incidents, all to be on top. For example, in early 2015, an Uber driver was assaulted by some masked men armed with knuckle dusters and a hammer, who were believed to be taxi drivers. Uber's regional executives discovered the incident and exchanged emails about how best to use the scenario to their benefit. The victims in these cases were encouraged to file a police report by Uber with the aim of getting it shared with the press.
Well, of course they should be encouraged to file a police report, but I mean, personally, you could just go ahead, attack the car instead of the person.
One part of an Uber executive's email discussing this incident had this to say: "We keep the violence narrative going for a few days before we offer the solution. You see, all the violence, all the tension was just optics for Uber. They would incite violence."
They really say that? That's fucking crazy.
And then do their best to spin the blowback to their own advantage. But if Uber was willing to incite violence to sway regulators, what else were they willing to do? Well, like all major corporations, Uber had an army of lobbyists that were eagerly waiting to put large sums of money into the right politicians' pockets. And as usual, this was extremely effective. There have been many instances of countries or cities moving to ban Uber, then pulling out at the last minute. But even when this method of financial incentivization—
I wonder how rampant that is in America. I know we have that problem with a lot of things, but specifically like pharmaceuticals
worked out, it was still a massive expense for Uber. And whenever these attempts did—
Lobbyists are expensive too.
fail. It ended up becoming more money that Uber sent down the drain. Uber, Lyft, and DoorDash combined have spent over $200 million attempting to force through a law that would strengthen all their grips on the gig economy. Known as Proposition 22, this would give additional benefits to these independent contractors, but the bill would ensure that workers are not labeled as employees. Uber even directly campaigned for this bill by advertising for it in their app, despite substantial efforts from worker advocacy groups to prevent this. This proposition passed in November 2020, and for a moment,
Again, like I don't think that they should have to adhere to like a minimum wage like or schedule in any capacity. I think it's better off the way that it operates. Actually, I wonder how taxis operate. Because are taxis, do they get like benefits? Like, what do they get? Like a cut, maybe? Maybe they get a cut of their. How do taxi drivers get paid? Like, I wonder if they. Oh, I understand now. Okay, so here's what it sounds like, at least in New York City. So it says during the driver's shift, they collect 100% of the fares and the tips. The difference between what they bring in and what they pay to lease the vehicle is how much they make in wages. Usually about $25,000 to $40,000 a year, depending on. Okay, so not for nothing. From what I'm reading here, and maybe it's not updated, but it sounds like just as bad as Uber on the driver's side, where you're leasing a fucking vehicle. I guess it's like the same thing as renting out a space in a like haircutting place. So, I mean, they're not guaranteeing minimum wage either, whether they're doing that or splitting money, or right? Like they're not. It doesn't sound like these taxi driver places are guaranteeing minimum wage. Because how could you imagine? You got some guy who's like, oh, you couldn't really get any fares, and then you're just paying a minimum wage for what? I don't know. It kind of makes sense that you wouldn't really. It kind of makes sense that, I mean, you can't really pay somebody consistently for that, can you? I guess I understand like a bus driver. It's a little different because they're doing a point, they go A to B, but
it seemed like Uber's multi-million-dollar legal gamble had paid off, but only 6 months later after this verdict, the entire ruling was deemed unconstitutional and was subsequently nullified. This meant that Uber had wasted tens or potentially hundreds of millions of dollars, all for nothing. And to make matters even worse for Uber, this failed lobbying fell through during the height of the pandemic, when Uber's cash flow was already tanking due to the low demand for transportation. But one of the worst scandals for Uber were the allegations that would surface against a number of the company's top executives. In 2017, when a major sexual assault allegation went public,
allegations of sexual harassment and gender discrimination against Uber led to company-wide investigation. Was that in the actual company or in the driver? Successful claims against Uber in a full-scale probe that company's treatment of its female employees and customers investigator reveal company-wide issues, gender discrimination. Oh yeah,
it would go on to further tarnish Uber's reputation even more. You see, earlier in the year, a blog post was written by former Uber engineer Susan Fowler, who alleged a culture of toxicity, harassment, and discrimination at the company. Uber responded to the outrage by ordering an inquiry into the assertion, and evidence was found that many of the company's executives were indeed complicit.
Uber is awash in investigations after former engineering employee Susan Fowler published a blog post alleging that she was sexually harassed and that the case was mishandled by human resources and senior management. Uber won't end there. It's also suffered a flurry of department departures by senior executives, including heads. Okay. I wonder what that means. Like, I wonder what the sexual harassment means. Like, I wonder how far it goes, because if you look at something like Blizzard, or even like made World of Warcraft, or even like Riot Games, they were doing some crazy shit. Like one I think in Blizzard, one of the guys did, like a manager like dated a coworker, a subordinate, which was whatever, but then afterwards like leaked her news, and then she I think took her own life. There's things like, I know this sounds insane, but there was things like they would like fart on the girls and stuff like that, like crazy shit. Like that's like harassment. I wonder how bad it was, or like what it is, because I also know that like sometimes guys, when they're together, like, say inappropriate shit like you're gay, this and the other thing to other guys, and they'll be gay with each other. Like when I used to work my job, it was a lot of men, because we cleaned buses, so we're cleaning like vomit and fucking shit and everything off the bus. And there's a lot of guys, so we would be gay, you know what I mean? Like, we would fucking try to grab each other's balls and shit. Like that's just what guys do, like just be stupid and gay. And then like might make a woman uncomfortable. So I wonder how, like, what type of harassment. Either way, like when you're around somebody who's uncomfortable, regardless whether a man or a woman, with the behavior, you should stop the behavior. So it doesn't really matter that much. Like the way you'd handle it, be like, yo, you got to stop fucking around with this shit.
But what many didn't suspect was that this behavior went straight to the top. Kalanick, along with 20 other top-level employees, were implicated and forced to sell all their Uber shares and immediately step down. Now, for a company
That sounds good for them because the fucking Uber was dying off anyway.
That spoke so highly of modernization, it was a massive blow to their public image, especially due to many of the public's fears of sexual assault with Uber drivers.
Yeah,
Kalanick was already on thin
issue.
ice for his aggressive company growth policy, and this incident was just the final nail in the coffin for his career at Uber. But since his departure, things really haven't gotten any better. Just last year in 2021, London moved towards bringing much tighter regulations against Uber.
I told you got lucky.
New legislation states that Uber must pay a minimum wage to the over 70,000 drivers in the UK.
That's just such a dumb fucking idea. That's such a dumb, like, honestly, like, what a dumb ruling. Because here's the problem is the dumbest fucking ruling there. Okay. So the way that Uber and Lyft works is that anybody could become an Uber or Lyft driver. We'll focus on Uber. Anybody could become an Uber driver as long as you have like a valid license and like a car that I think that the stipulations has to be at least, like, can't be more than 10 years old. It's bullshit like that. What that means is that it's very easy for Uber drivers themselves to saturate the market with too many drivers, right? But that's not really Uber's fault necessarily. So if you end up implementing something dumb like that, that means that Uber has to implement an additional infrastructure where they have to basically unregister a bunch of Uber drivers based on a multitude of factors. It's just not realistic. I'm pretty sure taxi drivers don't get paid in like with the minimum wage. I guess it depends on where you are. We just looked at New York City and it didn't seem like the case. So yeah, I mean, like, it's, I feel like the better way to regulate it would be like New York, where they're like, you're gonna have to pay basically like a sin tax, like cigarettes, for instance. You have to pay like a 50% tax, I think, in New York it is on cigarettes. And they take that money and they invest it into helping people quit smoking for free. Something like that makes a lot of sense to me. It's like, hey, you know what? You're just going to have to pay a tax to us so that we can subsidize companies. That makes sense. With this is just like a very intentional way to try to destroy Uber. And I can understand hating them, but like, this is just completely unreasonable in my opinion. It's kind of stupid to provide these different things, force them to provide these things,
while also being required to provide,
because then those Uber drivers would have to be forced to actually work like a real job, but they don't. You can go on, and a lot of drivers would just quit because a lot of people are just doing it for like 10 hours a week. You know, hey, we're just working for 10 hours because they're just trying to, like, maybe they're working on the weekend. They're just trying to make a little extra money on the weekend. You know, it's dumb. And that was one of the nice things for me about Uber was the ability to only work it when I wanted to. When I was just looking for some extra cash, because it's hard to hold down like two like legit jobs, especially since I worked at night, so it was easier for me to like do that.
Holiday pay. This government order is incredibly expensive relative to Uber's standard payment model,
It's
and will
a dumb
further eat
idea.
into any of the profits the company was hoping to make. Which brings us on to the fourth and final reason why Uber's in deep trouble. They just aren't profitable enough anymore. You see, all the legal fires that they have to put out internationally continues to hold back their profit margins, and these margins were either thin or non-existent to begin with. The pandemic also hit Uber especially hard, as demand for ride-hailing services was falling sharply. Although the company has somewhat recovered in recent months, it certainly can't be called smooth sailing. Surprisingly, Uber managed to make a profit of roughly 50 million in the last quarter of 2021, but they still have lost billions from their stakes in other companies. And this newfound profitability is mostly the result of the price hikes that Uber has been implementing into their app. In response to the growing issue of driver shortages, Uber has pledged to raise their fares by 5% in London alone. And if other locations follow the UK's lead in forcing Uber to treat drivers like employees, this will only mean more money lost for Uber. All of these problems just won't go away for Uber, and this is killing their worth as a company. Uber stock is currently sitting around $30 a share, but just a couple of years ago in early 2021, this was $60. And although Uber's recent profits could be seen as a good sign, it's still a long road to secure sustainable profits for the company. And that's
Well, see, that's the problem with looking at stocks, though. And like, listen, I'm not super educated on stocks, but here's what I do know: is that in a lot of instances, companies will they'll be very short-sighted and they'll do what's best for the next quarter. It's 4 quarters a year, obviously, and so a lot of times they'll make really bad decisions for the company from a long-term capacity, but because it'll look good on their next quarter, and then they don't really care. They'll just kind of move on, and these things operate like quarter to quarter. Whereas Uber might, and I don't really know this, be in like a mode now where they're like, okay, we have to stop worrying about the investors right now and focus on like what actual solid longevity to this place. So like, yeah, we're gonna take a hit in this the profitability of our stocks, which is just imaginary value to me, right? And we're gonna focus on the actual long term of the company, which sounds about right. Paying the drivers more, trying to get more drivers in. Sounds like they have a driver shortage, things like that. So the one thing that would be considered a little shitty though. It's, if you think about it, is they're offering an increase in the price of an Uber to pull more drivers in, which makes sense. right? You up the price of the Uber, people using the service will pay more. Some people will actually want to use Uber less because it's more expensive, and then it'll bring more drivers in. So like as you lose, maybe you lose some people driving, but then you get or some people taking the rides, but you're going to increase the amount of people who will be able to drive, so they can kind of like meet at a really reasonable point. So you're not just like missing out on money anyway, because that's what will happen. Because I imagine they probably influence. I think they do. Could be wrong. And a thing where it's like if you can't get a ride, it'll continuously expand the area where they'll pick a driver up front. That means the driver gets paid extra money to go there in the first place. Same thing happens with like DoorDash and stuff, because you have to make it worth the driver's while. But that means to me that they'll like prices were probably like under what they needed to be when there was a oversaturation of drivers. Because drivers are like, well, fuck, I'll take whatever, So it's interesting.
That's why investors are pulling out of Uber. They've seen that Uber has failed to reach the monopoly it was destined for, and because of this, they're looking for alternatives. Although despite everything, there could possibly be a light at the end of the tunnel for Uber. Most of the company's problems are coming from their drivers, while the self-driving cars coming around the corner, and these problems might just be temporary. A fleet of autonomous vehicles would add some much needed stability to Uber's business model.
Yeah, but then that brings up a whole other fucking conversation when you talk about self-driving cars, because if we do get to a point where we can implement self-driving cars, we're talking about displacing tons and tons of jobs. Technology is a very good thing because it can make things cheaper, because you don't have to pay a robot health insurance and whatnot. It's cheaper to maintain. That's why they're implementing self-checkouts at grocery stores and whatnot, things like that nature. The problem is that it displaces like a ton of jobs. That's the bad part. So like it reduces costs, but then there's less people with money to put into the market, right? So the issue with this is that like if you do self-driving cars, like you're displacing tons of jobs. And where does it stop? Is it just cars, or are we now doing trucks? Are we doing buses? If you have like really good technology, we're putting tons of people out of business. We're putting tons of jobs out of business. Like I think in 27 states, truck driving is the #1 job. How many millions of people are going to lose their entire way of life? And so if they did have a thing with their self-driving cars, frankly, we should legislate it so that there would have to be a pilot. Just like in an airplane, the plane flies itself. The pilots are there to take off and land, and in case there's an emergency. That would be the same thing here, is that they should force people to be in the car in case of an emergency. But even if that happens, even if it happens where we implement self-driving cars, we force a pilot, basically, realistically speaking, that person is going to get paid less than somebody that actually has to focus on driving the entire time, because they can literally sit in the front seat and not really worry about anything or really do anything until some kind of a warning alarm goes off that's like, oop, we got to get our shit together. So
But even this possibility might have its drawbacks. Right now, Uber doesn't have to pay any kind of maintenance or even fuel costs for the cars on their payroll, since that's all paid by the drivers instead. Uber would have to take on all these costs themselves if they switch to autonomous vehicles. Additionally, self-driving cars are a technology that still needs years of work before being truly safe. So even though this looks like a quick fix, it won't be materializing for Uber any
5-10 years, honestly.
Time soon. And this is a fact that Uber certainly knows all too well. In fact, in 2020, they pulled nearly all of their capital out of self-driving car research, even after spending billions on it. The program was already in jeopardy after a lack of results. When one of Uber's prototype cars struck and killed a pedestrian in 2018, it was only a matter of time. But the
Damn. It killed somebody? That's horrible.
Results. When one of Uber's prototype cars struck and killed a pedestrian.
I mean, that guy was, why the fuck were they walking in the middle of the road so slow? I'm not trying to be an asshole.
In 2018, it was only a matter
I wonder what happened there.
Or that lack of results.
Because, like, this is the middle of, like, it looks like a kind of a busy highway.
When one of Uber's prototype
and it didn't see that person.
Car struck and
which it still should have.
Pedestrian in 2018.
But
it was only a matter of time. But the instance.
Damn, that's just crazy.
Still caused them to pull out of their ongoing research. And unfortunately for Uber, they don't have the money to burn on research anymore, which is why the future is looking incredibly doubtful for Uber. After over a decade of simply non-stop controversy, violence, and chaos, the company is teetering on the brink of collapse, and only time will tell whether they can outlast the storm. But without a monopoly, self-driving cars, or mass deregulation, the company's survival seems more and more unlikely with every passing day.
Okay. Makes sense. Hey everyone, thank you so much for watching, and a special shout out to all my Patreon patrons, my YouTube members, and my Twitch subs. If you'd like to learn how you can contribute even more than you already are by simply watching the video, you can check the links down below, which will unlock a special feature depending on the platform that you subscribe to, such as Patreon here, that will get your name right here on this wall. Thank you so much, guys, again for watching, and have a good one.